joining us for the webinar on Global Mobility Programs, reviewing the critical components in partnership with Mercer. I'm Neha from People Matters, and before telling you about today's agenda, let me give you a brief about today's topic. Today, it has become critical for global organizations to manage the international mobile workforce. There is a pressure on organizations to compete effectively with their global mobility programs. Hence, they are adopting a structured approach to global mobility programs. This webinar will give you an insight into the critical components of an effective expatriate program. This will also enable organizations to devise effective programs to manage their workforce that frequently traverses borders. Global mobility is a costly, complex, and time-consuming process and has to be designed carefully. International assignments have to be supported by well-crafted international policies and practices. Key points which we will cover in this webinar session are: what are the critical elements of global mobility programs? How does an organization gain competitive advantage with effective global mobility programs? What are the ways to align global talent mobility and business outcomes? We have the privilege of having with us Ruchika Pal. Ruchika currently leads Mercer's Global Mobility Practice for India and is also the India's CRS product leader. Ruchika is an experienced total reward professional with experience of local rewards as well as expatriate rewards for the last 12 years. She leads the team helping organizations enhance their ability to access talent and knowledge globally and to leverage employee mobility, aligning it with talent as well as business strategies and employee development. She actively engages with clients and consults them on issues and challenges related to expatriate management and international HR. Her technical expertise spans areas such expatriate policies consulting, expatriate compensation design, local compensation data analysis, including executive and non-executive compensation and benefit surveys, compensation structuring, pay branding, job pricing, benefits, due diligence, etc. Our partner for today's webinar is Mercer. Mercer is a global consulting leader in talent, health, retirement, and investment. Mercer helps clients around the world advance the health, wealth, and performance of their most vital assets, their people. Mercer's more than 20,500 employees are based in more than 40 countries and they operate in more than 130 countries. We have saved time for you to ask your question at the end of the webinar. For those watching the live webinar, you can submit questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A session. We will try to respond to as many questions as time allows. We have a full exciting agenda for the webinar today, so without any further delay, I'm going to hand over the webinar microphone to Ruchika. Over to you, Ruchika.
Thank you, and a very good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for such an overwhelming response to this webinar. We are very happy to note that we have more than 200 people who have subscribed and hope to see them all join us today. So hope you find the next 45 to 50 minutes interesting. And we have already been provided with what is the context of today's session. And with that backdrop, I would like to call out that we'll be covering the following topics in the agenda today: aligning talent mobility with business outcomes, seeing why it is important for organizations to link business strategy and mobility strategy together. Then looking at what are the critical elements of a strong mobility program to ensure that, we are able to meet the objectives of the alignment. Then looking at some of the trends and insights that is, directly off the shelf from one of our research that we've recently concluded, a benchmarking exercise. And then over to some concluding remarks and question and answer sessions. So before I start over with, the alignment with business outcomes and strategies, I would like to provide, pause and say what has been the evolution of mobility and what has really become the, how has mobility transformed over a couple of years. So we earlier started, this is about 2 to 3 decades back, when we started with mobility primarily being driven by large multinationals, not really so much of Indian multinationals. These were assignments typically moving people from US, Europe to countries. So it was typically moving people from west to east. and assignment typical duration was 2 to 5 years, and very attractive expatriate packages, to the extent they were extremely handsome expatriate packages. Then came a time when we saw, this change a little bit, where we saw growth of new markets coming up, increase in demand for global mobility on the rise, and introduction of a new era of offshoring and onshoring. And we also saw a very different type of talent move from east to west, which are not typically the ones which are handled by, kid gloves. There were people in the junior management, middle management, which started moving, while the talent still continued to flow primarily from west to east. As we progress further, where we stand today, there has been greater technological advancement, greater cooperation amongst nations. There's an emergence of new breed of mobile workers, and with this fluidity of talent, mobility has become a new normal. It is no longer, a function of the international MNCs. It has become a new normal for Indian organizations which have huge expansion plans. We're looking at increasing footprint globally, and thus the need has arisen to look at integration of global mobility with talent management and ensuring that it is no longer a standalone function, and there is a need for strong linkage. And these assignments are typically being viewed not just from a perspective of fulfilling a business need, but for creating global mindset, for creating global leaders, and for creating a talent pipeline which can be seen as robust and available to meet an organization's objectives. So with this, let's move to why it is important for an organization, a clear linkage with organization objectives. So here I would like to call out that while a business strategy is defined, it is important for HR and the business to align and know what is the business structure going to look like today and tomorrow, and how global is the company plan. It is very important to understand how is this model going to be driven by organic or inorganic growth. What will be the key drivers? Are we looking for more revenue from inside the home country or more revenue drivers from outside the home country? Then what are the global aspirations of the company? So the business plan, nowadays companies are not just looking at a 3 to 5 year plan, but are saying, what am I going to do in 2020? What am I going to do in 2025? How is my strategy going to be governed in a long-term plan? So all of this needs to be dovetailed to ensure we craft a strong people strategy, for more importantly encompassing the entire talent management framework. So mobility needs to have linkage with not just the business strategy on one side, but on the other hand needs to be strongly linked with talent management strategy as well, where it needs to call out directly and articulate the important linkages with, say, for example, career development. What are the skills and paths that we need to develop that optimize global capabilities required in an organization? Second is rewards. Then what are the accurate rewards which we need to deliver for the work performed to encourage mobility? Are we giving mobility packages which are discouraging people, or are we giving packages to people which are so expensive and handsome that everybody wants to go on an expat assignment today? Are we driving the right behaviors with it? That is why PMS is very important, so that you're able to look at, what is the business need and how are we driving the right behaviors and rewarding people for the right performance and capability management issues. Then selection again is very important. The candidates that are hired need to have not just the right qualification, but also need to have the right culture fit, which is very different when you hire domestically. They need to have the right attitude and skill, because this per se can become later a reason for an assignment to fail, and thus selection is an important criteria which needs to be dovetailed. Succession is again a very important criteria which needs to be dovetailed with the mobility practice and policy, because do we have a plan if an assignee fails, who next, or are we left in a limbo that time? We should typically have a talent pipeline nicely called out, and the overall succession planning should address this very strongly. Then doing workforce analytics, which is to say, how do we know how to optimize ROI of an assignment? How to measure the success of the assignment? Do we look at what the retention ratio is? So all these factors essentially are important and link with the talent management framework. Then moving to the other part, saying mobility needs to play a much larger role with respect to fitment to the overall objectives of an organization and HR. This function needs to have a stronger focus which is not reactive. There was a time when companies get a first-time mobility request and the immediate reaction is little knee-jerk. We start scouting for information. We see what is available on the net. We try to look for channel partners to give us some information. But all of this is very reactive. If an organization knows that, in the next 3 to 5 years, I have plans to go to Far East or I have plans to go to Latin America, then as a mobility function, rather than being reactive, one needs to be more proactive to see what are the kind of things that need to be built in other than what is already available, rather than waiting till the last minute. So it is important that, we start with not just ad hoc processes, but look at how we can really work on a long-term basis and not just be transactional and tactical, but look at things which can be more value-adding. For example, have stronger ties with talent management. Each talent management process today should have clear linkages with the mobility plan. We need to be, like I said, proactive, give alternate choices. If we need to know, policy should be built in such a way that it has exceptions, but exceptions should not become the rule. So you need to say, if this is an exception, then what? If this is the second exception, then what? There should be a clear-cut answer to all the exceptions also. You need to have greater policy options, and that's why I'll come to later saying segmentation is important. And critically, you need to value and focus on what is the return on investment we are expecting this program to make, and what is the duration in which we should be effectively measuring the return on investment of this program. So here are some of the key areas that we need to look at when we are looking at overall the mobility environment. Workforce planning is the most important thing, saying how to look strategically for sourcing and planning to meet talent needs. Do we look in-house or do we look at sourcing talent outside? Do we look at a local talent or do we look at talent in the host country? These are important questions to answer. The next aspect that we need to look at is how do we identify and select the right people? What are the kind of competencies we need to look at to ensure we are able to minimize the risks of assignment failure, fitment failure of people when they are going for an international assignment? What is the value proposition we are offering to these candidates? Is there a carrot or is there something that we are pushing people because we have no other option? So we need to have a value proposition which is able to set competitive, cost-effective rewards for various kinds of mobile assignments. And in the end, what is important is how do we ensure that mobility investment delivers the right expected results? I spoke a little on how do we optimize return on investment. Thus, I would say it is important to ensure that we build metrics right in the beginning that drive retention, rewards, performance all at the same time. Some of the examples would be, are we able to retain people when they return from their assignments or they typically don't find fitment here and they leave? Are we able to show them a career path saying when you come back, you are not force fitted into the same grade that you left because at the end of the day, they have gained some experience and do not expect to fit back? Are we still trying to fit them in a peer group which they left from because they have now a much larger exposure in an international assignment rather than the area that they were doing at a very domestic level? Do international assignees, another metric could be, do international assignees, their experience results in higher performance grades? Are they getting the better ratings? Are they able to drive the business that we're expecting them to drive as compared to the peers? So these are some of the factors we need to look at to ensure we have enough return on investment from a standpoint of, mobilizing our workforce. Moving to the other factors that we look at when we're looking at expanding mobility beyond, what we currently do. Right now, the mobility function typically is, in many cases, more like a function which is providing data and information, but not really value adding with respect to other aspects. So the boxes that you see in gray are areas where one would say we are focusing, but we need to reduce our focus there or maintain the focus there, but increase a sharper focus in the boxes which are colored. So for example, while cost estimates are important, it's only that much data driven. Managing relocation, managing repatriation, managing vendors is the role which can be done at a very tactical level. What is more important is that we need to start focusing more sharply on selection, segmentation, valuation of the assignment, and retention of people. And that's exactly the reason why determining the ROI on mobility from a purely financial perspective is challenging, because we need to balance everything together. And these are some of the areas we need to focus on to ensure that people, the function starts gaining more importance and visibility. And there is greater say of the function because it is, like I said, more proactive and strategic in nature rather than being only tactical, which will not really help solve all the purposes that we aim ourselves to look at. So with that question in mind, what are the critical elements that will enable us move in that direction? And what are the critical elements that will help us design a policy or look at a policy framework which will address, a good linkage with business strategy, talent strategy, and enable people to see merit in the kind of mobility that is being driven for the organization's objectives. So let's move to some of the critical elements we see for a strong mobility program. While we get on to crafting a mobility strategy, it is essential to ask and question certain areas as HR, saying what is the nature of mobility the business is looking at? It is mobility for whom? And we'll go into these questions as we progress further. How much mobility is being planned? And what is the future plan? For example, what is the future plan on repatriation? What is the retention plan? What if? These are the things that we need to look at as scenarios from a broader mobility perspective. So overall, let's look at what kind of mobility. Now here what matters is nature of mobility. Are we, for example, looking at mobility to broaden managers' global business knowledge, have them move internationally without changing business or group? Or are we looking at building managers' ability to lead a particular business unit, have them change functions within the same unit? Or are we looking at sending people for setting up a business? Are we looking at sending people for building business? Are we looking at sending people for basically looking at newer markets for the organization? Or is it after we've acquired a company, we're sending only 2 to 3 critical positions so that, after an acquisition, we're able to align that business with us? So we need to clearly know what kind of mobility are we trying to drive while looking at overall mobility. Then again, looking at mobility for whom? Is it a sponsored mobility whereby we're looking at designing mobility assignments only for the high potentials? This may work best if you are trying to identify and retain managers once they've experienced several rotations, which is what many MNCs today drive. Are we looking at contest mobility, which is basically opening up internal transfers in an international location, which allows people to, compete for a promotion and helps them, see and be confident of a competitive nature? And or is it default mobility, which is to say, I have a opening in that particular location and this is my best fit, so this is the candidate, just organize the moves, which is where many companies today are. So it is important to know it is mobility for whom. Is it being linked to talent strategy? Is it being linked to something which is ad hoc? We need to define it and be able to ensure that we're able to link it back to business strategy and talent strategy together, because it cannot be only one. Then how much mobility? The business should be able to answer some of the critical questions while we're trying to design and define how much mobility. For example, how much time in each position are we looking at? Will the person come back or move to another international location after that? How many international moves are we looking at? Or is it within the business unit or outside the business unit? All of this matters. And then we need to look at what is the future plan. What is the plan of repatriation, succession planning? Will the business get the person back into their current mainstream business or send the person next on another assignment? All of these are questions which need to be defined while we are crafting a mobility strategy. And this cannot necessarily be in a standalone basis. Another perspective which needs to be kept in mind while we're looking at mobility is the fact that you need to consider the entire life cycle. A typical assignment life cycle, while we put in here 4, can be further subdivided into 7 sub-steps. So for example, you may have assignment planning, assignment selection, critical pre-departure services, assignment start payroll initiation, ongoing assignment administration, compensation and tax preparation, and then finally repatriation and post-assignment services. So you need to keep in mind that when you're making a mobility policy, it cannot be driven by only, for example, how am I going to compensate that person? Rewards cannot be the only driver of mobility policy. It has to encompass end-to-end, right from selection, which is typically left out in a mobility policy, up to repatriation. What happens when they come back? What is the kind of feedback process we'll put in? A mobility good policy document will contain all of these areas end-to-end to ensure that you are able to answer all questions and are able to provide details to all your candidates and the business of what the plan is for the purpose of mobilizing workforce. The next key area that you need to consider and focus on from a policy standpoint is the fact that there are multiple stakeholders when you're looking at mobility. And people who are mobility practitioners will agree that this is like a web of information, a web of stakeholders, and a web of people you need to manage, be it internal, external, be it people, vendors. So, and plus the environment is very dynamic. You're looking at an environment, as soon as a person steps out on the land from the country, you need to look at a very, different environment. You have factors such as immigration, compliance, legal, tax that start, impacting you. HR people often do not have information or are the experts in all these areas, so there is a need for cross-function collaboration, which is very essential. Then you need to have alignment with senior management and the stakeholders. You need to be then aligned with a lot of vendors, for example, destination services, relocation agents, vendors for payroll, etc. So this is an important aspect you need to put in there. And then you also need to look at, say, insurance vendors. How will you really manage medical benefits? So all of these vendors become very critical while you're defining a mobility policy, because this is an environment that you operate in. And especially from a legal, tax, immigration standpoint, anything that's left out becomes a compliance issue, and none of the organizations really want to land in that zone while looking at. And that's you need to look at, you need to typically visualize a much larger framework to be able to ensure that your policy addresses each and every aspect while you're looking at designing a strong mobility policy. So what really matters when you're looking at, you typically may have a policy exist as is. So what is it that you need to do? You need to describe your current state, which is to say, what role does mobility play in your organization? Find out how many moves each type of managers are making, how long have they stayed in each position, what is the rotation cost being, the impact of that cost to your organization. Break out the facts by business lines, geographies, workforce segments. You may have some data and analytics if you're an organization already moving with a mobility policy and has been running with a program for a couple of years. And you also should be looking at, why have assignments failed in the past, or how many exceptions have I really given to a policy, which tells us, is a trigger for us to understand that our policy has become a rule of exception rather than a policy framework that needs to be worked upon. The next important thing while you're looking at your policy piece is to assess the impact, which is look at the positive and negative consequences of your current mobility program. It is very essential to engage senior decision makers on talent mobility issues and to create a sense of urgency with them, which means that, essentially mobility is not a standalone policy. It impacts people, it impacts businesses. If the policy is flawed, people may go half-heartedly, people may be there but not deliver their best. If the PMS system is not aligned correctly, people may not give their best there. So it is very essential for any mobility program to keep taking feedback. Keep taking feedback from the business, keep taking feedback from the expatriates, keep taking feedback, and have a constant channel of communication. And thus it is important to gauge and assess the impact of the program as an important second step, because engaging stakeholders will also mean you are gaining advocates for mobility, and it will help you quickly resolve issues internally as well, because you're not the only custodian of this program. It is important also to do the math correctly, which is understand the benchmarking of policies against competitors and general market dynamics, to be knowing that you are not really off or away from what the general practices are. For example, you've sent someone to Indonesia, and there are other companies also that have sent expats to Indonesia. What then happens is, if expats tend to meet each other, there is an exchange of information that happens on, what is happening with other companies, and then that may result in dissonance with the current expat, resulting in an expat wanting to, go back to headquarters and say, I got a raw deal. You do not want that to happen. You don't want a critical position assignment where your expat starts feeling the pressure of getting a raw deal, and that's why it's important to know what other companies are doing from assessing the impact and gauging the current mobility program standpoint. And then what is important is defining a future state. Having done your homework correctly, having understood your internal stakeholder expectation, your expat feedback, having understood what is happening in the other companies, what are the benchmarks telling you, then it is important for you to ensure that you play out these scenarios and then assess the kind of changes that you should be making in your mobility program, and looking at, what is the impact of cost that may come because of that. In some cases, you may also be able to find loopholes in the policy to arrest cost, which will be a big factor for you to look at from a standpoint of trying to see how you can really manage costs effectively. So it is important to define a future state with cost-benefit balance and analysis, and thereby looking at how you can craft a policy which can be strong and successful. So now let's look at how we can really simplify and try to see some 6 key factors that should be kept in mind to ensure that we have implemented a successful talent management, successful talent mobility policy. So the first thing would be to build a comprehensive talent planning process, and that's where I would say you need to link it strongly with the organization's objectives, business objectives, and talent strategy. And it should be able to support a growth strategy of the organization and should be an enabler and not be an inhibitor overall. More important is the fact that talent management map and linkage is important. Mobility policy cannot be a sore thumb overall in the talent management framework. It has to be strongly aligned to selection, to career planning, to rewards, to succession, because all of this can have impact on the success or failure of the assignment. Important thing to note is the fact that you need to engage with stakeholders importantly, not just internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders. And when I say that, I mean you don't need to only look at senior decision makers, you need to look at advocates for mobility within the organization. You need to remember family plays an important role. They are a very important stakeholder in the success or failure of an assignment. You cannot ignore the family while you're looking at a mobility policy and a framework. And most importantly, in the end, is to look at doing the math correctly, which is to say trying to benchmark and looking at what other companies are doing, so that you have not crafted a policy which is not aligned with what market practices are. And in the end, it may turn out to be a very expensive policy for you, or it could also be a policy which results in dissatisfaction to your current international assignees. And that's why it is important to keep doing a check and revising your policy on a periodic basis, rather than making a policy which is for posterity, which cannot really last, because we function in a very dynamic environment, and we really need to look at policy on an ongoing basis and thereby be able to value add to the business effectively. So since I touched upon the topic of market benchmarking, we actually have some trends and insights which we wanted to share with the group, which is concluded from a recently, which is actually directly from a recently concluded 2015 worldwide survey of international assignment policies and practices, which Mercer conducts globally. We have collected data from March 2015 to June 2015, and we are happy to note nearly 54 Indian MNCs have participated in the survey. It's one of the largest database of mobility policies for the country. And globally, we have around 831 participants which have participated in the survey. And you can see it's a good spread across multiple geographies. And we currently are presenting the results mostly from 43 companies that have participated from the non-IT sector, Why we picked up non-IT is because IT and non-IT function very differently, and that's why we have presented the results more from a non-high-tech perspective. And what we're going to be covering in the next few slides is going to be broad trends of what Indian multinationals are doing, where are they typically going from an international assignee perspective, what are the key challenges they are facing, what are the key drivers for mobility for them, and then what are some of the costly decisions that they're making and how are they really managing costs effectively overall. So just a little bit more about this survey that we have. The survey typically has a huge spread of data. So we cover nearly some 800, 900 questions covering all these aspects of policy and compensation elements. And so the key things that are covered, like I said, you need to look at the entire life cycle. So you will notice that we're not just looking at one small portion of rewards, but we're looking at even areas like home leave, children support or spouse support, cultural training, medical benefits, etc. So it's a much detailed report which is available with us separately. So now let's go into what Indian companies are doing and where are they heading and what are the trends that we are seeing from an India standpoint. So it is interesting to note that a survey indicated that the top 4 destinations where Indian companies are heading today and setting up operations or have presence, number 1 turns out to be United Arab Emirates, 2 turns out to be United Kingdom, 3 is Kenya, and 4 turns out to be United States. And what the survey tells us is 70% of the companies are expecting an increase in long-term assignments. And an interesting change is the fact that 30% are actually expecting an increase in permanent transfers, which means they are not necessarily looking at sending people on expat packages, but are looking at localizing them and sending them on permanent transfers. And then if, they have to move thereafter somewhere else, it will still be a permanent transfer. So there is no entry and exit period. They are going there as a local hire. And that's again an increase that people are seeing. And this could also be a combination of hiring locally in those locations as well. So interesting to see US does not come as number 1 destination. It's UAE in the Middle East and Kenya in the Africa region. Moving to what's really driving these assignments for Indian organizations, we see a lot of M&A activity happening, a lot of organic, inorganic plans of Indian MNCs, which is resulting in driving many of these assignments. We are also noticing that companies are sometimes setting up greenfield projects, resulting in them having to send people, with certain technical skills which is not provided locally or for fulfilling a project need. In some cases, a majority we see where companies are looking at acquisitions abroad and they are essentially trying to send people only for managerial skills. So, for example, a CEO or CFO, not, something that they want to manage and control from India in the host location. So, managerial skills is a third key reason driving these assignments. And then another key driver is also supporting business expansion, which is where companies are looking at finding new geographies for business development, finding channel partners, looking at new markets for their products. And this is the 4th reason which is driving assignments for Indian companies essentially. So another factor we thought should share is, why are assignments failing? What are Indian companies seeing as reasons of assignment failure? Number 1 comes out to be adjustment difficulties. Number 2, poor job performance. Number 3, poor candidate selection. And number 4 is family issues. While popular belief could be that family issues are probably the most common issues for resulting in assignment failure, but if you notice the top 3 areas called out like adjustment difficulties, poor performance, or poor candidate selection, they very strongly relate to a talent management strategy. If a mobility policy is strongly mapped to a talent management framework, then the chances of these reasons going down are much higher. Reason being that you then have a very strong selection process, a robust selection process, which will ensure at least point number 3 being taken care of. Secondly, also the fact that Job performance could be, if a PMS process is strong and the KRAs have been defined strongly and clearly and have been communicated in an effective manner, then this can actually be adjusted and, managed from that standpoint. And you would have sent your best candidate. So individual capability will not be a challenge then if you've done the selection correctly. Adjustment difficulty, again, a softer aspect which is typically missed out by organizations is culture fitment. Most organizations select the candidate, select the country, but do not really look at culture fitment, capability, direct linkage, or the softer aspects of competencies in an individual, resulting in sometimes adjustment difficulties being a key factor. So what has happened is you've made all the investment of trying to pump in as much money to, select the, send the candidate and help the family settle, get the schooling for kids, get the best housing. But guess what? There is adjustment difficulty because there were culture fitment issues. And this could have been managed if we had a strong selection process, defined with competencies, defined with assessment of a candidate before the candidate goes, resulting in a good fitment of candidate. And these top 3 issues could have been managed better. Now looking at another information which is on diversity, saying how much of women workforce are we looking at, or are we seeing change in the last 5 years while they're looking at expatriation. So we have data from last 5 years, so 2010 to 2015. What are the kind of workforce changes that we've seen? It is interesting to note that we see currently in the non-high-tech sector, where we typically have top management level people going on as expats, only 6% of the total expat workforce is women, which is a very small number. Whereas in the IT industry, we see a much more encouraging number. It is around 11% of the total international assignee workforce, which is today seen as being from the women category. But what is healthy and emerges as a good favorable number is the fact that in both the sectors, the percentages have essentially doubled. The numbers would have been more than doubled. So net-net, we do see a healthy move in trying to position women as expatriates and trying to create a policy which, helps them also enable or look at mobility as a good career move. So another number here. Now let's look at a deeper dive in some of the policy-related insights, some of the costly decisions which matter to mobility. Some of these would be cost of living, mobility premiums, housing, leave benefit, and administration. So let's start with administration of policies. What we see as centralized versus decentralized, what are Indian companies doing? We note that most Indian organizations today are looking at a centralized and a partly decentralized model collectively. We still haven't seen much progress with respect to a fully decentralized model, which to some extent may not make sense right now, depending on what maturity level are you as an organization on a global mobility program. Having seen centralized versus decentralized, what is it that we look from a outsourcing versus a non-outsourcing model? Most Indian companies today are still, working with an in-house mobility model, whereby 61% of them follow that model more importantly. And if you see fully outsourced, it's a very small number. It's only 3% of companies which have a fully outsourced model. Now, moving to some of the factors which result in administration of policy. So we asked companies, what are the kind of things you're planning to review or have reviewed or are currently reviewing from a policy standpoint? So when we asked companies saying, what are the kind of areas in your policy that you have reviewed or introduced during the last 2 years, which would be 2013 and 14, a good percentage of organizations have actually said that they have reviewed allowances and premiums that they've been paying to their international assignees in the last 2 years. It's very interesting to see nearly 50% of organizations have also reviewed their policy, which is a very good practice because, like I said earlier, policy cannot be a static document. It is an evolving document and it has to be revised on an ongoing basis to be able to ensure you are aligned with the expectations of your stakeholders and aligned with what the market practices are. Having seen what companies are currently reviewing, We see a good population of companies currently reviewing compensation approaches, which is what kind of compensation packages should we be paying to expats. This doesn't come as a surprise to us given the fact that organizations do have the pressure of cost and expat packages tend to be very expensive. So organizations keep revisiting what can be a good package to pay to ensure we are cost effective. Additionally, we also saw 30% of companies seeing an increase in permanent transfers. So resulting in companies also looking at not just giving expat packages to international assignees, but also giving them local packages of those host countries to make it more cost effective. What is it that companies are planning to introduce over the next few years? Localization. I just spoke about localization. Localization, which enables companies to move their long-term expats into locals if there is no repatriation policy or if an expat gives an interest to say, I don't want to come back to home country but would like to stay in the country of my host right now. So localization is an area where companies are looking at reviewing policies in the current future. Moving to now another important aspect of the expat package, which is COLA, cost of living allowance. 85% companies in India pay cost of living allowances, and we see a majority of respondents used an index-based approach, which means they could pick different types of candidates at mid-segment, low segment, or a high segment of the index. We also see companies typically do not modify the index in India or change the category of the goods and services in the COLA basket. Typically, companies, have started capping allowances is the new trend that we see. So you see 58% of companies do cap or limit the amount paid for COLA allowances. However, we see that typically companies do not use a negative index. So if going from, say, India to a country to, say, Dhaka is cheaper, the company will not apply the negative index in any case. This looks at 42% because we have a large population which says they look at it from a case-to-case basis. But while the policy may be case-to-case, typically we hear companies not applying negative index overall. So this is something that we hear our clients say that they may use certain index for senior management, certain jobs, and that's how they may segment their policy. They could be reviewing it only, the COLA index is typically sometimes reviewed only when they have inflation or currency exchange fluctuation. Otherwise, companies typically do not tend to review, which is not a good practice, we would say, because it is essential to review. COLA, Mercer would recommend every 6 months to be able to look at the difference in cost of living from a home and host location. So this is on the cost of living allowance. The next and a very critical element of compensation package for an expatriate is housing, and you do see a huge population of our survey participants providing furnished accommodation in the host location. Typically, companies rely on data providers for freezing housing budgets and tend to update housing allowance. 71% tend to update housing allowance during the course of an assignment. Housing budgets are typically defined by family size and by the level of management. So if you are a family of one, you may be given a 1-bedroom accommodation as compared to a family of 4, which will be given a 2 or a 3-bedroom accommodation. Typical costs which are covered are security deposits and commission, and we see 63% companies cover that. Other than this particular cost, we see companies also provide for furniture, electricity, and building maintenance. But things that companies typically do not provide for include domestic help, gardening, parking, and those are things which are typically excluded while looking at housing. But what do we hear our clients say? We hear clients tell us that for high-risk locations, we may pay additional allowance for security. Employees given a choice to choose the locality, but it should be within the budget. If they want to choose a location, if it's a lower bedroom apartment and they want that location more importantly, budget is paramount. They cannot really move beyond the budget. Interestingly, there are some organizations which also allow employees or international assignees to opt for housing which is less than the budget, but then let them keep the balance with them. So it is an incentive to ensure that they meet they are within the budget that is defined for housing rather than going outside of that. So that's a critical part of it. What are we seeing on mobility premiums? We are seeing a downside to mobility premiums. We are not seeing companies say, yes, mobility premium is a practice that we continue with, and we are now seeing less than 1 in 2 companies say that, yes, they give a mobility premium. Those who give the premium typically give it as an ongoing premium. It is not typically given as a lump sum. It is typically calculated as a percentage of salary, and we do not typically see a capping on mobility premiums primarily because the percentages are small. And what do we hear companies tell us? We hear companies tell us that we use premiums as a negotiator for the package. We typically do not give more than 10% of a particular element of compensation as mobility premium. Some companies ask us, why give a mobility premium, especially because we're giving an international assignment, we're giving exposure and so much more, that is premium really important and should we really be giving? And this is not surprising because we have seen a dip in mobility premiums being given. Now coming to another aspect, which is looking at home leave and vacation. So there is still a trend to give home leave and vacation, and we see 50% organizations still continue to give home leave and vacation. And typically it is delivered with actual tickets or redeemable ticket vouchers. Most organizations, if you see 1 in 2 say that assignee needs to, home leave is for the home. Assignee cannot barter it for a holiday destination, and that's called out clearly. 60% cover transportation costs during the home leave, and typically companies do not allow assignees to accrue home leave. And with this, I would now like to summarize what all we've covered so far with respect to the entire gamut of the session. So number one, I would say mobility is here to stay, and numbers and types of assignments is only increasing. UAE and Kenya emerge as the top destinations, as we saw, and adjustment difficulty and poor performance are the key reasons for an assignment failure. And the reason we need to be more importantly looking at talent management framework is because of this, because you need to strongly dovetail the strategy and planning of mobility with not just the organization strategy, but also the talent management planning and strategy. Policy management is primarily still being done in-house, not really outsourced is what we see. And what we see companies reviewing typically are compensation and benefits, not surprising again because cost is an important factor, and companies cannot continue to bear the expensive expat packages. So they're looking at innovative ways of reducing cost. And mobility premiums are losing their shine. Like I said, companies are asking, why do I need to give a mobility premium? We're giving much more to them, and it's an opportunity and linked with a strong framework of career. So do we really need to give a mobility premium for that? So with this, I would like to say thank you very much for this session, and happy to take questions now. But before I end, I just wanted to let you know that the survey that I spoke about is actually a survey that has been released already. And you can actually take an offline copy of that report if you want. Like I said, we have 43 companies sharing practices on a much larger area that we've covered from a WIPP standpoint. And what are the kind of things you need to build in your expat program? All of that gets covered in that. The second thing that I wanted to share with you is that we are happy to announce that Mercer is hosting its first expat management conference this year on the 3rd of November, which is 2 weeks from now, 1 day less, Tuesday in Mumbai. The event is going to be hosted by Mercer, like I said, and what we plan to cover is going to be latest trends and insights on mobility landscape in Asia and globally. And what are the kind of cost drivers that are companies using to ensure that mobility programs are not very expensive for them and they are still very effective. Trying to see how companies are managing expatriation in Africa. We have a speaker again from a multi-industry group organization, Indian MNC. So we're going to hear perspective on how are they managing expatriation in multi-industry, multi-country environment. We expect the sessions to be fairly interactive, and most of the speakers are going to be industry speakers, so you can come and hear on practices. So if you're interested in any of these two aspects, any of the to offerings from our side, please feel free to write to me. So with this, I would say thank you very much, and over to the People Matters team.
Thank you, Ruchika, for such an insightful session. We will now move to Q&A session, and the first question which we have received is from Urvashi. She is asking, what are certain aspects that HR should focus on designing policy framework for short-term travelers who would travel for a duration of, say, between 3 months to 1 year?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Urvashi, for this question. Short-term assignees are typically, like you mentioned, duration of 3 months to 1 year. And when you're designing a short-term policy and per diems, you need to keep in mind that you shouldn't be using the same metrics or same data for per diems that you use for your travel policy, because travel policy is designed with an assumption of hotel stay, whereas short-term assignments are not. Travel policies are designed with an assumption of all meals outside and no option of cooking, yourself. So a short-term assignment policy should be able to look at, value-adding data which is going to help you, reduce cost, because foreign travel policies can be very expensive. So that's one part of it, saying your policy should be able to define that. Second aspect is you should be able to define fly-in, fly-back models and be very cognizant of the compliance norms, because if the travel short-term assignment is still fulfilling the residency period, then you may have tax regulations that you need to be mindful of. So a policy should be able to look at how you're going to ensure that you don't end up in a compliance situation because of the stay of duration crossing the residency period.
Thank you, Ruchika, for such an insightful answer. Our next question is from Nutan. She's asking, knowing that May India talent is moving to UAE and Kenya, how do you ensure culture fitment of these countries?
So culture fitment, whether it be UAE or Kenya or US, or we have some organizations going to very different locations also. Look at the IT sector. They're going in every destination that you can think of. Culture fitment is more about assessing the candidate on certain cultural aspects, and there are various organizations today which help assess the competencies on culture fitment, assess the cultural fit of an individual and the family before they are said yes, they are selected and they are ready to go for an assignment. Organizations are also spending time and money on some aspects of culture training, giving them culture, tips and important aspects that they need to keep in mind while they're going to this particular destination. Additionally, companies are also spending money and time on language training and orienting the family also on what to expect when they go in that destination. So these are some of the things that organizations are doing, be it UAE or Kenya. They're doing it for all countries that they're sending their expats to.
Thank you, Ruchika. Our next question is from Rajendra. He is asking, when we send some management people for learning, what things to be care as mobility policy?
So when you say learning, I'm assuming you're sending them on an assignment because you want to, it's part of your career framework that they need international exposure. And not necessarily because, so what happens is there is a segmentation approach on mobility where you can actually create not one size fits all policy, but have a different policy for different type of assignments. And we can connect offline and I can share more details around this, where you can have a sponsored assignment versus, where your organization is sending an employee on who is a high potential versus sending someone who is actually asked for a transfer themselves. There are different policies that come in play. Someone going for strategic skills versus technical skills. Companies actually today are looking at innovative ways of segmenting their policy and thereby having, cost-effective measures by not really giving a very expensive proposition to all the segments that can be part of a policy.
Thank you, Ruchika. So our next question is from Ulka. She's asking, can you explain on role of PE mobility and how to leverage it to the most?
So pre-mobility mobility has actually various aspects with respect to how you're going to be sending people and ensuring they are fitting. So it has a lot of aspects, like I said, culture training, home looking, sending people on trial trips into that destination so that they see, yes, they're interested in going. Then looking at relocation services, culture training, language training. A lot of that comes in the, ensuring that you are prepared from a departure standpoint and from a candidate fitment standpoint. So employee readiness is very important. Addition to that, you need to ensure from a compliance standpoint that the immigration, tax, and legal aspects are all covered. So from all these aspects, an organization needs to be prepared from a pre-mobility standpoint.
Thank you, Ruchika. Our next question is from Prerna. She's asking, how does Global Mobility Program help us in aligning people's strategies with business outcomes?
Like I said, if a global mobility, business outcome, if it is driving certain, if an organization is looking at growth strategy, which is going to be inorganic growth and most of the revenue coming from international locations, you cannot ignore the fact that the talent strategy has to be aligned with that strategy. And your talent strategy should have a strong mobility framework built in with all, linking it with all the aspects to be able to ensure that, people are able to see that this is a global mindset that is required. This is the kind of business leaders that we need to develop. So everything starts gearing up for that. It's just not mobility. It's also the right competencies in place, the right behaviors you're trying to drive. All of that gets dovetailed together, and mobility becomes just one part of that talent strategy.
Thank you, Ruchika. Our next question is from Vandana. She is asking, should we have a differentiated mobility policy for different levels in the organization?
So actually, policy is one. Typically, if it is only the level differentiation that you're looking at, the entitlements can be level-based, like housing entitlements, car entitlements, education entitlements. We wouldn't say that if you have different levels and the only differentiator and segmenter you're looking at is the level or the grade, have multiple policies. We would just say call out the entitlements separately, but continue with one mother policy.
Thank you, Ruchika. Our next question is, how exactly can the talent management team be involved in mobility programs wherein selection and succession is mainly skill-based and technology-based?
So talent management team can actually be very strongly linked to the mobility program because, like I said, talent management will have rewards, performance development, selection, succession planning, career development, workforce analytics. The different spokes are all there. So the different spokes are all there. It's a wheel. So the fact is that if you have a rewards framework, you cannot ignore a rewards framework by not calling out what your rewards framework will be for international assignees, not just when they are expatriating, but also when they're repatriating. Even like you specifically mentioned, selection and succession planning. While it is very technical skills linked, but if you see the slide that I showcased saying why do assignments fail, because of wrong adjustment failures or because of wrong selection. This is exactly where the softer skills become very critical and essential. While I agree in a technical framework, succession may be based on skills and say, okay, this assignment, this person doesn't succeed, we send the next person on the bench. But from a selection standpoint, I feel talent management can play a much larger and important role to ensure the culture fitment and adjustment failures would reduce.
Thank you, Ruchika. So we have received a lot many questions, and looking at the time frame, I would request you to take all the questions offline, and we will take one last question which we have received from Prerna. What are the factors that have contributed to the evolution of mobility?
So, like I showed in my presentation deck, Prerna, is the fact that, there are multiple reasons for organizations today looking at mobility, and that's how it is getting evolved. A lot of Indian companies are driven by trying to, look at growth avenues, organic and inorganic growth, so setting up greenfield projects or acquiring companies outside, and there is greater partnership amongst economies resulting in organizations finding greener pastures outside just India. the current state of the economy results in companies not really in, looking at trying to drive maximum revenue growth out of the country because it could have reached a particular potential, but trying to see how they can maximize overseas opportunities. Also, the fact that there's technology advancement that has happened resulting in, companies looking at skills, particularly moving from India to outside India because we bring that domain knowledge with us. So a lot of reasons resulting in evolution of mobility, but the key is that now mobility is being driven not just like an ad hoc process. It's not those one or two people who come and go. It's a much larger population, and it's now being seen as a larger with a larger linkage to the talent management process, with career building, with skill enhancement, with international exposure, the kind of competencies that will drive an organization in building, what they say is a global mindset.
Thank you, Ruchika. And with this question and answer session, we are going to wrap up today's webinar. Once again, we thank today's webinar partner, Mercer. Finally, our special thanks to Ruchika Pal, the speaker for this webinar, for her time and invaluable information that she has shared with us today. And I would like to thank everybody in the webinar audience for participating in today's presentation. We will come back to you with many more. That concludes today's webcast. Thank you and have a good day.